Pat struggled to stay seated. Please, God, just let the bidding go up. The gavel snapped crisply. Sold to number 410, $15,000 for the Fabergé brooch. Patricia Devereaux craned her auburn head, eager to see who had captured Olga's treasured crescent pin. Searching the crowd, she saw movement 2 rows ahead. Sitting on one of the folding chairs in the venerable Churchill's auction gallery, a wraith-like old woman dressed entirely in black smoothly replaced her green auction paddle in her lap. As the woman rose to leave, Pat got a better look. Luminous dark eyes peered out from her magnolia-skinned face. The woman's raven hair could not be untinted, but Pat suspected that years ago the shiny black had been its natural color. In her time, she must have been a real beauty, Pat decided. But now, the former beauty would be wearing Olga's brooch. Pat felt a tug of sadness. Dear Olga. How many times had the tiny Russian woman lovingly attached that pin to the collar of her carefully starched linen blouses? Olga had cherished the white enamel crescent, studded with tiny sapphires, a gift from her father who had once worked in the studios of the famed jeweler, Carl Fabergé. If an old woman was to wear this unique pin, Pat preferred that it be Olga. Fabergé, the imperial jeweler to the last Romanov czars. Pat and her 19-year-old son Peter watched the distinguished-looking auctioneer standing at the raised walnut platform stationed in front of the large room. Well-dressed men and women spoke softly into the telephones at desks banking either side of the auctioneer's podium. Their job was to efficiently express bids made by potential buyers not on the floor of the sales room. The auctioneer expertly moved through the numbered items in the Churchill's catalog. A small copper ashtray embossed with the Russian imperial eagles went for $1,400. A pair of silver Fabergé asparagus tongs earned over its estimate of $2,000. A silver table lighter in the form of a crouching monkey went for $25,000. The monkey's expressive face and lined forehead had clearly charmed its new owner. "What do we have for the gold cigarette case?" Pat studied the picture of the cigarette case featured in her program. The 14-karat golden cover was monogrammed and featured a diamond-set imperial eagle. When pressed, the sapphire thumbpiece opened the elegant container. Beautiful. 4,000 once? 4,000 twice? Sold! $4,000 to number 196. Pat recognized the buyer. It was the same man who had purchased Olga's silver cigarette case at last year's auction. The tall, pleasant-looking man was wearing a tweed sports jacket. She guessed him to be about 45, maybe older. As she studied him, he looked in her direction and smiled. Did he remember her from last year? "That's Professor Kavanaugh, my Russian studies prof." Peter was out of his seat and headed for the cigarette case buyer. The men shook hands, and Pat watched as Peter gestured toward her, and she could see his lips form the words, "That's my mother." Pat thought the professor looked surprised, maybe even pleased, to hear the information. Pat was used to it. People often commented that it had to be impossible for her to be the mother of a 19-year-old. But she'd been Peter's age when her only child was born. As Pat looked on, she was surprised herself. Seton Hall University must be paying good salaries. Fabergé cigarette cases didn't come cheap. The men shook hands again, and Peter came back to join his mother. His face was flushed with pleasure. "This is great, Mom," he whispered. "Meeting my favorite professor at a Churchill's auction? I think he was surprised to see one of his students at something like this." Pat enjoyed her son's enthusiasm. Peter was such an earnest kid. She often found herself hoping he wouldn't get hurt. "I told him about your shop, Mom. He said he'd like to stop in sometime." "Great, sweetheart," she whispered back. But she was more interested in what was happening at the front of the room. The numbered treasures continued to fetch small fortunes, and Pat felt the electricity building in the crowd as the star attraction slowly made its way closer to the auction block. Then it rolled into view.